Today we're talking to Abhishek Jha, the co-founder and CEO of Kiwi AI. I'm really excited to have Abhishek here. Perhaps you can kick us off and tell us a little bit about Kiwi.
Sure. So at Kiwi, we are basically building an outcome-based generative automation platform that can take the busy work of the knowledge workers so that they can do the best work that they have for them. Basically taking away the mundane stuff, taking away the repetitive stuff that actually takes the creative time off them so that they can focus on the more creative, high quality.
Interesting. It's interesting you're mentioning that using the word outcome based, and I'm starting to hear that as a theme. So tell me more about that. Like, what do you mean by outcome based? I don't want to prejudice the answer here. Tell me more.
Sure. No, so yeah, I think as a company we are outcome obsessed, and I think the expectation with the AI native platforms by the customers is the agents are sort of able to perform the task that human was doing otherwise. And once you get into that realm of definition, I think the core uh, the core measurement criteria sort of goes down in the direction of how many hours are saved, what's the ROI that's being generated. Is there an opportunity cost that was lost but that's not lost because you have been there, right? I think that is the direction in which the top management, generally head of department, sort of start looking into. And so, yeah, I think fundamentally, if you compare that to SaaS, I think the big difference is you are using them as tools. Now you are expecting agents to perform the act.
Which means it's the outcome, not the tool. Since it's not a tool for you to use to get to an outcome, now we're actually talking about the specific outcome. Maybe, can you give maybe a couple specific examples of the types of interactions that your agents are doing?
Sure. Like you're working with one of the leading emerging M&E companies based out of LA, and they basically have a process where they're like, tens of thousands of contracts from which there are like 200, 300 data points that can be extracted, mapped against the payout data, you know, indicate relevant stakeholders if there are triggers in the contract that are being hit. Uh, and so now the expectation is, and then basically finally pushing it to, let's say, sales, some CRM where the whole RevOps is being managed. And so the expectation is not just, someone using that tool, but the expectation is, oh, I put in like, I don't know, 1,000 contracts overnight and the agent sort of run overnight for like 6 hours, 8 hours, and perform and do all of these things, push it in various uh, system of records that that they're basically using, and map that and give like a report, more that sort of ready. Right? So it's almost like expecting an employee that's working overnight for them, and putting it out, for them.
And that's very measurable in terms of
Yeah, I
the
think
human
it's
labor
very
that
very
would have been traded
measurable because,
off.
yeah, because you could literally measure, like for these many contracts, these many man hours would have been spent, and hence these many dollars would have. Now you're not spending. Uh, I think that is the more linear sort of ROI. I think there's also an angle of like a step function ROI in most of these cases, which is being at the right place at the right time. And so if you had humans doing, and let's say they were taking a longer time, you could miss out on opportunity and hence opportunity cost being there.
Oh, that's interesting. So
Uh,
by increasing the pace, you open up new opportunities you would otherwise miss. I'm curious in terms of adoption and the usage. Are you seeing primarily tasks that people were doing that are being moved over to the agents, or are these entirely essentially new tasks that would not have been done because they would have been too time consuming and there was no time to do them? And the difference here is, are these P1 tasks that we're just offloading from people, or were these the P2s and P3s that we always wanted to do but never had the time to do?
uh, so I think what we are seeing is, P1 is sort of like the more natural get in into these organizations. It's very sort of in your face. Everyone in the org sort of seeing, these are the us. Um, the department sort of, the knowing about those things, what are the mundane, tedious, painful things that are there. But I think once, as you grow along in the adoption, I think the expectation of the clients and the customers also start increasing. And that is when you see, the P2s and P3s also sort of come in. Things where you were probably earlier doing like sampling. Like, let's say, as an example, you basically had, let's say, compliance team doing the call monitoring and auditing. And if you look at the
Hmm.
earlier days, you were probably doing the sampling and then doing that, and so was the regulator. Now, because you don't need humans to be, sort of listening to those and doing that, but you can have an agent that can, sort of scan through the entire, uh, call records. The expectation is now moving to, can we have this to like 100, right? So you
Interesting.
are sort of seeing that piece as well, where people want things that weren't being done earlier. Now agents sort of doing that. But I'd still say, like the get-in is, or the P0, P1s are like, what was already being done, because that's very sort of visualized.
Well, it's interesting. I was going to ask along those lines in terms of adoption. It it sounds like you're suggesting that those are being tackled because they're better understood. They're more present, they're better understood, and therefore can be translated. Um, what about expectations? As people are adopting this kind of model, this way of thinking, and I think at one point you talked about as sidekicks. You have a sidekick for these different tasks. Um, how are they mapping well what can be done? How do you see people's sort of mental model of what's possible and what they should give to the agents progressing?
Yeah, so I think that is where, I think it's important, as an AI native company, when you have like customers, sort of have the expectation reality map match. Um, and so, I think what you also sort of realize as you work, with customers, and things that we have seen is, they will probably have initially, like the highest of expectation, um, right? And so, the expectation would be like, 100% accurate, and, everything else, and blah, blah. But I think, and they'll start using it, let's say, right? But I think once they start using it, they do realize, it cannot be 100% accurate or as they want at this point of time. A lot of especially complex workflows which are there. But let's say it's at a 90-95% accurate, or it's, let's say, at a 90-95% if you're measuring it on a scale of 0 to 1. They do see the the value that is being generated, the ROI that is being generated, and the fact that, you can just have now like one person sort of overseeing this and sort of getting that done. That actually inspires them for the adoption, right? Right.
Interesting.
So I think, yeah, the thing that we have seen is, the expectation initially is like, sort of extremely high till the reality hits them, and there's a middle ground then that sort of goes.
Kind of folds in.
Yeah.
You've been a founder before, and I wonder if you're seeing is that adoption, that experience, then having it kick in. Are you seeing the go to market motion different with Kiwi as an AI native versus prior companies that you've helped move forward?
Uh, yes. I mean, in the sense, like I mentioned before, right? I think with AI, because it's so new, and to the point that we discussed, right? The ones that are more measurable and visualizable are the ones that people are going after. But there are, of course, a lot of other processes that can be improved, value and efficiency that can be unlocked, that you don't see on the surface. And so, with the earlier startups that were done, or let's say pre-AI era that was there, you knew the problem and the solution. The the client or the customer also knew the problem and the solution that they needed for that. Now, as you sort of get in, there are other opportunities that sort of start getting unlocked, right? And so I think the land and expand thing is what is working best for us. And as I talk to fellow founders, that sort of they sort of resonate the same. the same.
It's interesting. Previously, people are buying like a number 14 wrench, right? They know exactly what they need. And yeah, they may look at different, well, this one's titanium and that one's steel and this one's something else, but they know they know the tool. To your point, they know the problem. With AI natives and especially agent based companies where you're solving actual business problems or real world tasks, I think there's a moment you already talked to about, is it magic? Where does it work? How well can it work? Getting, finding that level. Uh, but also there's a lot of noise, right? Because there's so much conversation and consumers are now experiencing AI via ChatGPT and other places. Uh, do you find that you're what's it like to cut through that noise to make sure people can find you and discover that in fact you can solve these problems for them? How have you approached that part of the problem?
Yeah, so I think like you always tell to our customers, like our superpower is we don't do like recorded demos. We just give demo live there with your data, or and I think that that has become really important. If you want to cut through the noise, you want to show them the value on their data right there, so that they don't feel that something is doctored from before. Um, I think, and I think it's been talked a lot, but I think making agents work is by far the biggest challenge for all the companies. Um, and I think the bar has also increased to the extent that people do not just want like a POC product or like an MVP. They want something that can sort of fit into their existing tech stack, process stack, from day zero, and run it enterprise.
But the shape of it is different than anything they've had before. So there's been a lot of conversation about the forward deployed engineer, and there's some relationship between the FDE and the solutions engineer, but their roles are a little different. Have you made use of either? How are you seeing that?
Yes, yes. So I think the solution engineers which were there were predominantly there solving for what was being sold. I think a big sort of role of FD, and yeah, we do have FDs in our team, but I think a big role of FDs generally out there across orgs, uh, is not just sort of deploy and make sure that the adoption is there of the existing solution that they're selling, but also look for other opportunities and avenues within the organization where the agents could actually be put in, to make the processes more efficient. So there's a portion where you're actually doing the solutions part, but there's also a portion where we are doing the discovery part of what else can be made better within the organization. I think the third piece is, which is what we discussed earlier, the adoption part. Right? In part,
Yeah.
they're also responsible for, because you want, uh, wherever your system is getting deployed, you want pretty much people around the org or any department sort of using we want people in that department to be extremely comfortable with using the platform. That's one of the reasons we have very tightly coupled it with Slack and Teams, and our thesis is we want to meet people where they're actually already comfortable, so they can actually call agents and run agents and do all of those and get the output in whichever tech stack they're using.
Um, are you finding, maybe I'll say it the other way around, which is I'm finding that quite often these sort of early calm solutions or forward deployed engineer, and I agree with you, they are different. A lot of the time is spent on education. And in some respects, when you're describing understanding the organization and seeing what problems or what opportunities exist, that can be automated, where people may not know, hey, I'm doing this task. It's become such a part of their daily life they don't even know that that task can be automated. So discovering those opportunities is part of the role, but and so is helping people understand just how to make sense, and how to do it themselves. Uh, and I think that that's become fairly common. I'm also struck that you just touched on something again. It's a pattern I'm starting to hear over and over, which is we all know as founders, you start with the user, start with the problem, solve the problem for the user. But let's face it, a lot of startups wind up being
Yeah,
engineers and building as engineers,
yeah,
speeds
yeah,
and feeds. But I think with LM powered apps, whether they are literally agentic or just some complex system using models, it really does put the user back in the center. You really do have to look at the use case because the delivery is different. I'm curious how you've thought about how you've built the application from a user first perspective or an outcome perspective to go harken back to the beginning of it.
yeah. So I think there are three things that we hold very core to what we have built, right? The first one is, of course, out of boxes that we sort of built. And I think for anything to materially stay long enough or you want to clearly show the ROI that is being generated off it and is that's actually measurable. And you can only stay long enough if there's continuous ROI that you get. So that includes us. The second piece that's there is, and when we actually started building, and you're right, we are all sort of engineers and techies, and so we started building a platform. Um, but I think what we sort of realized as we started talking to the customers, right? And because we were predominantly trying to target, or we are rather predominantly trying to target knowledge workers,
Mm,
right? I think there are people who have targeted the like cursor and printer and the like targeted developers, but I think if you look at knowledge workers, they're probably like a billion knowledge workers, so maybe about 70 to 90 million knowledge workers, just
much bigger market.
right. So um, I think what we have seen with them is they actually want to interact with these agents in a much more natural way
Mm,
than how developers interact, let's say, with cursor in VS on the IDE. Um, and so that is when we started, and we could see, the friction essentially as we asked them to sort of do drag and drop and create like regions, connect them, create a workflow. And so as a next step that we thought, as an abstraction layer, what we should take in house that actually makes life easier for them was, uh, we were like, why could it not be that they actually interact in natural language, and we have a meta agent that can create these agents for these workflows um, on behalf of them for the tasks that they have. And so for them, all of this becomes like the hidden layer. For them, the meta agent is the only agent that they interact with, that can create workflows, that can run workflows, that can fetch things for them, and they can interact with the meta agent in natural language. I think if we look at knowledge workers across industries, if you look at financial services, you look at media and entertainment, services, like you look at any industry, right? Knowledge workers end up spending a lot of time working with unstructured data, which are in documents, contracts, right? Moving data across different data silos, right? Different SaaS platforms, SaaS data. Making some business logic or some logical sense out of the data, and then pushing
yeah.
it into some other system of records and stuff like that. Like if you look at a typical knowledge worker, he'll come in at 9 a.m. He'll have his coffee. He'll spend the next maybe hour, couple of hours, going through the mails. And then these are the stuff that he pretty much does, till like 5 p.m.
Yeah.
And so
Transforming data all day.
exactly, yeah. I think the data, um, to a certain degree, doing back and forth stakeholder management, scheduling meetings, stuff like that, right? A lot of these things can actually be done by agents. So they can actually take care of, or they could actually think along the lines of, what could be done that can make the business better, that can make it go better, that can improve the margin, right? Like stuff like that. You don't want them to play with data. I think AI is much better with data, or rather, not just AI, but like machines are much better with data than humans are. But I think insights are what humans are better than AI or machines in general, right? deducting things off those data points is what we do with. And so having these guys focus on that uh, should be the focus of all agent-led sort of companies trying uh, you know work across.
So, do you encounter misconceptions or about the work within the enterprise, and specifically about how to consume AI to do some of those tasks?
Yes, we do. In fact, when we first started sort of giving them as let's say no code, low code sort of platform where you can drag and drop and do stuff like that, you could actually see, I mean, the good thing that we did was, uh, you know, we used to actually work a lot of very closely, with our person. And what we then realized was for a lot of these things, let's say the agent is expecting a JSON or something else, it's expecting data in a certain format, certain schema, and the agentic workflow has been built in that manner. The user doesn't really, I wouldn't really say care, but he doesn't know or he doesn't have time to go through the entire thing to understand, right? And so the misconcept, actually, that is where I feel most most of the times systems break, because the system
Oh,
that is being
interesting.
built is expecting data in a certain format, is expecting a certain type of data, but the user doesn't know and doesn't care enough, and the
Yeah.
user is
And why
actually
would they? They're not engineers. They're not the ones
yeah,
working at that
exactly, and they are
level.
expecting, as they would have told to another colleague or an intern or someone in their
Yeah.
team. For them, that is literally the kind of experience that they want.
Yeah. They're not. Well, I think what's interesting about this is that um, what I'm starting to see is that people are realizing that we don't need to ask people to act like engineers. A lot of SaaS tools at the end of the day asks the knowledge worker to act like an engineer. And when they work well, when the tool is well built, it doesn't do that. But most tools do require you. But then by incorporating language models, by incorporating language and a more human oriented interaction pattern, we're starting to see those details slowly, or they're starting to fade away and get handled in the background. I think it's really interesting that you described having a no code plug and play, drag and drop type experience, and that you then moved away from that and towards this meta agent where people can just have the conversation. They can ask their colleague, which happens to be Kiwi, ask their colleague to go get this work done because it needs to get done. And they can articulate it. I'm sure Kiwi can come back and ask questions. I'm sure
Absolutely.
there's some sort of exchange there. And then they go off and do the work. It really modifies the entire work environment. Now, I don't think we know, but I'm expecting that that's going to have its own change management to it, its own issues of
But
adoption
it's a
and
much
whatnot.
lesser change management, I would say. And I think it almost sort of struck to us when we started thinking, um, how is it that a user is interacting with that platform? And so the user would first create the agent, uh, right? Then connect those agents to sort of create a workflow, and then run that workflow and perform tasks. Right? But we then sort of asked ourselves, right? Is this how we start thinking about things? Maybe not, right? We first think about the process, right? Then you break that down, right? So it's almost like flipping what you were doing. It's almost flipping the narrative of how you're doing, first creating the agent, then connecting the agent to create the workflow, and then running that. And we wanted to
Sure.
literally flip that, where you define the process, because naturally that is how humans think. Then break
Yeah,
that
that's interesting.
and which is why the whole natural language to the meta agent that can actually then first plan and then create those agents and then connect them to form the graph. But for you, you're giving it a process, right? And it's much easier for a human to articulate the process than build a work like a block diagram of a work.
Sure. Well, the block diagram workflow requires the user to somehow understand how the engineer is thinking about the problem,
Exactly.
as opposed to the opposite. I also find it really intriguing, and I want to make sure I understood what you said, because it's a really interesting, nuanced point, which is if the agents they're interacting with, if they can do so via language, then the adoption curve is lower because they're not having to learn a whole new way of thinking.
Absolutely.
Instead of having to adapt to this new SaaS tool that just showed up and having to learn where the buttons are and how to navigate and the 52 new words that they've never seen before, instead they can use the language they've always used based on the task, describe the process, and it gets figured out. Which then theoretically lowers the bar for adoption.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to add here a point, Matt, that I think the previous generation of SaaS tools that were there were meant more. No, I mean they weren't really meant so much for making the lives easier for knowledge workers or employees. It was there to make lives easier for the enterprise to actually run. We are now moving into an era where you actually want to make lives easier for the people who are working, alongside making lives easier for the enterprise or how it works, right? So if you
Yeah,
look at a
that's
lot of these, legacy sort of systems and so on and so forth, the adoption was so high because it's almost like a single source of truth across the entire org. It's really important for the organization. Uh, but for the knowledge worker and for the people who have had to use that, it was very painful.
mm-hmm.
And so now the knowledge workers also want to sort of come out of that and be able to interact with stuff that is easy for them. They don't want to have those challenges that they've had for the last year.
And then it benefits the enterprise as well. The
Absolutely.
enterprise wants tools that are easily adopted and are already guaranteed to provide the, a clean, consistent, traceable solution on the other side. But that piece is the given now. The given is that the data will find its way. Now the challenge is, well, how do we enable our folks to do more,
Yeah.
to work more quickly, and also to on open up the door to other tasks that they would otherwise not get to. I think that that's something that we've kind of touched upon here in the conversation, but it's also very present in the broader conversation of, well, we're talking about labor displacement to some degree, right? Work
Yeah.
that you would have done is now being done by an agent. But that workspace, if you will, the space created, will get filled with other tasks. And I do think we'll see some changes from that standpoint as well. And I think we'll see every organization has a backlog of things that they wish they could do and can't get to. Maybe we'll start to see some of those get done
I
in this
agree.
model.
I think to the point that you mentioned earlier as well, there are always things that the company wants to do, but they just feel it out of their bounds because of bandwidth constraint and stuff like that. I think those would sort of start coming into the realm of where the organization can actually think, oh, we can get this done. The other
I
thing, yeah,
Oh no, go.
now the other thing that that I feel really important to the point that you mentioned is and this is what I feel. I think process telemetry, as we call them, uh,
Hmm.
is going to become the move, which is the one who understands the processes and hence can make them better within an org will become the most sticky AI vendor to that.
Oh, that's fascinating. Do you think that's the hurdle that most enterprises will need to overcome in order to adopt AI?
Yes,
Is this process tracking?
yes, yeah.
Interesting. Where do you think that's owned? Like where in the enterprise is that owned?
So that's the issue. The whole challenge is because it's not centralized, like it's not
Mm-hmm.
owned centrally, right? And I think nobody really did that as well because people did not see the reason to sort of track that and own that setting until you would basically have agents that are able to sort of do the task and improve and observe and and essentially improve the process after observing. Let's say an agent is observing a certain process for like 30 days. 31st day, the agent can actually automatically start suggesting how you could improve the process. Because you
Hmm.
never had an intelligence of this kind earlier, you never really had uh, an incentive to track process in this manner. uh, I think now this will become important, and I think the ones who are measuring this and are and sort of benchmarking against that and improving are the ones that will sort of win the deals in those orders.
That's fascinating. I building on that, it strikes a chord. Um, Whenever I've operated within large organizations, I've been a huge proponent of OKRs, and specifically objective key result oriented management, where there's clarity on the objective and that people can measure the results. I don't know, but I wonder if the transformation you're talking about and that type of telemetry aligns really nicely and will help more organizations adopt that clarity of objective, because now you have these entities, you have people, and you have these agents who are able to drive some of the KRs, and it can be measurable, but it also means it can be shared and
Absolutely.
distributed.
Yes.
And I think that becomes the challenge, and it's interesting. That's fascinating. Well, I'm very interested in seeing more of what happens along those lines.
Yeah, and I think if you just look at that, right, just a point there, if you look at OKRs, right, a lot of the adoption was hard to sort of be done in organizations because the employees would not want to spend time filling that stuff and doing all of those stuff, right?
Yeah,
But now you could literally remove that. You could genuinely have like an OKR led organization,
yeah,
right? It
yeah,
was just
and
hard earlier because nobody would fill that in, right?
right,
They'll probably fill it on the last day. Like that usually used to be like the norm.
right, right. Yep. Lots more we could talk about there, but yes, indeed. I mean, there are many challenges for articulation of good objectives, watching the key results, et cetera. And I think it's fascinating, this idea of with agent telemetry, with agents put on tasks, and as you started the conversation with outcomes, with a more outcome oriented mental model, not only for go to market and for the value, but also for the measurement of is it performing and delivering on the value. It really does bring us closer to understanding our key results and being able to think about that more than pushing all the buttons for 5 hours during the day, right? Instead of pushing all the buttons during the day, we can think more about, well, what was that key result? Are we getting there? We're making those changes. I think we're getting near time, and I really appreciate. I love to ask people at the very end a similar question, and I think it resonates quite a lot with what you've been already thinking, because you've been putting the human first in this conversation. So I like to ask people about, what human skill do you think is needed and people need to focus on to really adopt and make the most of AI.
I think the biggest one, and in a lot of sense, ChatGPT has already started that movement in some sense. But I think getting comfortable interacting with agents
Hmm.
um, is going to be, and it's not even about being very technical about it. But I think just being comfortable interacting with it in the first place uh, is probably the first key skill that uh, that people would want in work 2.0, 3.0 as people call. Uh, but basically that because uh, I think everyone is going to over time start getting work done by interacting with it. And it's almost like a given, and there should be an assumption that's almost a given that the agents will not always get the answer right in the first time, and so you should be comfortable getting to the answer, talking to them, right?
You have
Uh,
to have that. You have to have that willingness, and you have to be thinking about it. You can't just accept. It's not a calculator. You have to actually think about the answer and look at it. No, I love that. That's a great answer. Well, thank you, Abhishek. It's been wonderful talking to you
Thanks,
today,
Matt. Thank
and
you
I
for
look
having me.
forward to future.
Likewise.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye.